everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. Now, we do apologize a bit for the weird radio silence on the podcast and the fact that we didn't have an episode come out for a few weeks. And I'll let Z get into some of the details with that.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of an unexpected break for us. We did get the interview with Square X out. We had
Thankfully,
recorded
we had
that.
that one recorded and went out. It was sort of perfect timing in that respect.
Yeah, had that kind of ready to go to help bridge the gap. We recorded that a little bit before things happened. But yeah, unfortunately, I've kind of had some things going on in my life over the last few weeks. I had a close family member die, and my focus has been elsewhere over the last several weeks. That's also in part, we do have one training update. We have our Hardware I/O training coming up. We have opted to move that to an online mode, so we'll be delivering that just online.
Yeah, we're moving the training to online. Part of that is because of, some of the unfortunate stuff you've had to deal with. Some of it is also because of the stuff going on with the US right now. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the politics of it. We try to steer clear of that on this show for the most part. I am a little bit curious, though, if any of our listeners out there who regularly attend conferences, I'm curious if you are attending US conferences this year, just because of the so Z and I are both in Canada. There has been a particular border tension between the US and Canada with electronic device searches and all that kind of stuff going on. It's been kind of nuts. But even people from other countries, I'm kind of curious with all of the stuff going on with the US, how many of you are hesitant to travel to the US? If you'd want to leave thoughts of that in our Discord, then I'd be really curious about it, because I know a couple people who are not going to US conferences this year from Europe who have before. And it's a bit of a shame because, we like to use conferences like DEF CON and whatever to meet up with people, and people that we usually only talk to online. You get that opportunity to meet up with them in person and go out and do stuff. And it seems like that's been disrupted quite a bit this year. So,
yeah, it's been a little bit weird on that front. Even for us coming through to do the training here, planning to come into Santa Clara to do this training at Hardware I/O. In general, as a Canadian coming through to apply to work in the US is generally a pretty lightweight process. There's been kind of some leeway in the past where you can make your application, and if they're about to reject you, they'll offer you the chance to withdraw your application, to be like, oh, okay, we don't find this compelling, whatever, and you can go through the appeal process and whatever, but they'll give you the option to just, withdraw that application. You can apply another day when you fix up whatever information they needed or whatever. And I've heard from some friends now, who have gone over recently, where they're not doing that anymore. It's at least in some cases, obviously, I can't imagine it's every case where somebody makes an application, they're going through the usual process. Some of that may or may not because part of the challenge with TNSS is you're always applying every time you cross the border, and you're making the application to the border guard. It's not this long drawn out thing, and they're just not getting kind of that option to withdraw their application, which then means a denial of entry is getting registered on them. That can result in issues whenever they actually do want to work in the future, if they go through another visa or something, and just a lot of issues being created over recent policy changes and how it's being enforced. Kind of make it feels a little bit risky to even come over on something where we should be okay, but it kind of is up to the border guard whether or not we're going to be okay. Unlike a lot of visas that you can apply for where it's all done remotely and you just go through the normal process. This some that happens at the border, which kind of increases the risk of just being detained because they don't want to offer kind of the usual you withdraw your application sort of deal. So yeah, it's been a little bit concerning to see that sort of change, because
yeah. And even beyond the trainings, I don't believe I will be traveling to the US this year. It's just not worth the potential hassle, which is, again, unfortunate. I do like meeting up with people, and a lot of the US based conferences especially are a lot more convenient for us to go to, because Europe, we have to fly across the Atlantic. It's a lot longer of a flight and everything. But
Yeah, it's really hard to drive.
yeah, yeah, pretty difficult.
Although speaking of Europe, we will be giving our training at Hexacon in Paris.
Yeah,
And
so that
that's
is the other thing we wanted to kind of announce here is that we have been accepted at Hexacon for the trainings. Those of you who are interested can check out the Hexacon page that we have linked for that. So yeah, a couple updates from our side, a little bit of housekeeping to get out of the way. And I guess the other thing that we should say is because we're going to be doing the trainings and whatnot, our next couple weeks for podcasts are also probably not going to be as consistent as usual. We might not get an episode out for like next week or the week after, for example. We'll see. We're not planning to go on our break just yet. We do plan to release a couple more episodes before our typical summer break. It's just the timing of when we do that, we're not fully sure on. So just wanted to give a heads up. All right, unless there's anything else you wanted to get into, Z, I guess we can get into our topics.
no, I think we can jump right into it.
Okay, so our first topic here is from Portswigger, and it's called Dragon Pwned, leveraging ASCII characters to exploit VS Code. And for the most part, what it's about is pretty much in the title. So it talks about control codes, things like start of header, end of text, end of transmission, things like that. You've probably seen them before at some point, especially the more common ones like line feeds and carriage returns.
Yeah, we've talked about a few of these types of bugs before.
Yeah. Some of these codes are less used today for their original purposes than they were back when terminals and serial were a lot more common, and they've been repurposed. So the readline library, which is used by Bash, for example, repurposes end of transmission for deleting the character at the cursor. And when you have these kinds of actions where, you can move to the beginning of the line or skip a line or delete a character on the line, you can run into some interesting problems, especially in editors that provide pseudo-terminals, for example, Visual Studio Code. So one case that they found was with the parsing of configurations, where you could pass arguments to whatever program is being run for that config. But if you pass control characters in that set of arguments, well, when VS Code sees the start of header character, for example, it's going to move the cursor to the beginning of the line. And that can be used to subvert what program is being run. So you could use that primitive to build up a command to run in reverse to effectively get command injection. Similarly, that could also be done with the drag and drop feature via the file path. If you drag and drop a file onto the terminal inside of VS Code and you have a file path that includes control characters, you can do a similar command injection. Now, this does seem to be a bit more of a problem in Unix-based systems than on Windows. Windows can kind of escape this problem a little bit because NTFS doesn't allow control characters and file names like like a fair amount of Unix file systems allow. And the other thing is that VS Code's terminal defaults to PowerShell, which also doesn't interpret certain control characters like cursor movements, which I actually wasn't fully aware of. Sort of an interesting tidbit there, but yeah, those things put together make it so that this isn't as much of a concern on Windows, but on like Mac OS and Ubuntu, these are potential things to be aware of. Now, Microsoft doesn't really consider these security issues. They sort of classify them as, they already have warnings in place if you try to open a folder in VS Code, for example, that they ask you, like, do you trust this? They sort of have some of those barriers already. And because of the user interaction required, they just don't really treat those as serious vulnerabilities. That said, this post points out that this could be an issue in other contexts beyond VS Code. VS Code was just kind of what they looked at for this sort of issue. But as Z mentioned, we've seen this sort of issue in other applications before where it is a bit more of a sensitive context.
I actually think we've seen it in VS Code before too. I don't remember for sure if we've covered it in VS Code exactly, but I feel like we have covered a bug with VS Code before. Either way, like, it is a pretty high ask, but part of the challenge there is the application itself is already in like a high user, like high, I don't want to say high trust. It's not like VS Code is a high trust application or something, but you have that high barrier of having any sort of attack against VS Code because it is like a local client-side application that somebody is using, an active user is using. It's not like a remote web app or something. So you have that boundary already that exists that makes it difficult to attack. And then these sort of things kind of exist, I think, within that attack surface, but that attack surface is kind of reduced just because of the fact that you have these requirements. Not sure how this actually impacts so with VS Code there's a lot of cases of running it in the browser. That might also be a case where you're also going to have, like, more often than not, servers tend to run Linux over Windows. And so going off into Bash and perhaps, or going off onto the Linux shell and all of that. So you might also have some of these issues kind of appear on the website too, which maybe does make them more usable, but I'm entirely not sure. That is purely speculation on my side.
Still interesting research, though. Control characters are one of those things where it's easy to not think about them, especially these ones where it's, like everyone kind of is aware of line returns and sort of the problems you can have with those. There's been endless desync attacks that are based off carriage returns and line feed issues. But the more obscure control codes, like these ones that allow you to change the cursor in a line, yeah, I haven't seen quite as much about it, and it's quite an interesting post, as always, from Portswigger.
Yeah, and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think what we have covered in the past wasn't necessarily these control codes. It was, or I know we've definitely covered, like, Bash color codes, and, like, the terminal color codes, terminal formatting codes. That I might have been mistaking it on that, actually, now that I'm kind of thinking about it a little bit more. Might have been thinking about some of those over specifically these control codes, but it's a very similar vibe in terms of the attack. It's, you've got this kind of meta information hidden inside of just the standard text data, and having that inline data means you can sometimes create these confusions where it interprets it as the wrong sort of thing.
For sure. So, getting into our next issue, we have a Twitter thread, so it's a little bit trickier to get through. Where we should be logged in for this one, so it will at least be easier for those who have the stream up. But it is basically a issue with being able to control the refer policy for leaking sensitive information through refer headers. So I'll let Z get into this one.
Yeah, and leaking information through the refer headers does feel like a fairly old school kind of attack that I remember looking for a long time ago, where people would put, like, cookies in the URL bar and stuff, and you'd maybe be able to leak that if you could somehow get a request made off that page to an attacker controlled page. You'd maybe have the refer in there, whatever. That has been less of a thing in more recent years, as, refers might be a bit more stripped down, not containing all that same information. So this kind of has two posts to it. There's Max here with the initial post I'm linking, where they actually had a bounty come through that they report basically an OAuth token leak through the refer header. And then Slosner, I'm sorry, I don't, we were kind of talking a little bit before the episode. I'm not sure how to say the name. Slosner is kind of how I want to say it, but I'm not sure. They called out, just today I used the technique that's probably not widely known. They have much more information about how this kind of works there, where they have kind of the core vulnerability is when attacker controlled image is present. And I guess what happens is Chrome will, on any sort of sub request or sub resource request, so images or, a sub resource, makes a request to that page. And if that request has the link header, and the link header is usually used to kind of indicate associated resources. So if you've got a page that's going to be loading out, like, maybe this massive JSON from some remote source or something, you can, like, have the page come down. It'll include a link saying, like, hey, also preload this other page. I'll pull up the information about that header, but it's a response header that can be included. So you can basically inform the browser about these other things that should load. Same kind of idea as the link tag in HTML, or the link element, sorry. So what you can end up doing with that, or what they call out as being able to do, is inside of the link header is you can include the refer policy you want. So even if the host domain has a refer policy that's going to strip things down, you can set on this link to be unsafe URL, or on this sub request gets the image, has this link header that says, yeah, use this unsafe URL as the referrer policy. And now that when it makes the request to do the whatever resource you're linking, it'll use the full URL for that, kind of overloading what the host wanted or may have wanted, leaking the entire URL. And again, you do kind of need that situation where you have sensitive information in the URL, which is often not seen as a very good practice for anything that's going to be long-lived, but OAuth is a good example of where you do kind of send some information along that way, where you may have a window of attack or ability to use that information. So that is kind of the example case that call out here. There's a chance, or there's a pretty good chance, that this may end up getting patched. It does feel like a bug on the Chrome side, and that is something that the original link that we have here, I believe they mentioned here that this will probably be fixed, so will take some time, as it won't be tracked as a high priority bug. And yeah, that's the thing. This is probably something that you might be able to get like a few bounties off of in the immediate point, if you're able to, for example, control an image or control any sort of sub resource that's going to be requested. It seems like a really fun bug to kind of return that, what feels to me like an older bug that I don't tend to see a lot anymore. So yeah, it was kind of fun to see that. Really cool find. Really, like, it's using the functionality, and I could see this being closed as like, it's not a bug, this is how it's supposed to work or whatever. But this does feel like, the host should probably have the priority and not allowing the sub resource to override what that referrer policy would be. But generally, you do want to keep sensitive information out of URLs in general, because there's so many ways those can get logged.
Yeah, difficult to really like lock down and control, and it's one of those things where it's kind of inherited from the way things used to be done before there was like better functionality and features in place to deal with it. So yeah, I mean, a bit interesting as an attack class. It is one of those things where it's going to be something you have to evaluate on a case by case basis, but
just ask AI to find it all for you. Just do some automated reports, put them out.
That is the number one trick that security researchers hate. Yeah.
No, the triagers hate. Bug bounty researchers love.
Triagers really hate. Yeah. But yeah, something good to have in the toolbox for sure.
Yeah, it is. It's cool to see kind of the return of that, and not something I'd really considered, where using the link header in that way. So yeah, definitely a cool tip.
Yeah. And continuing on the web side of things, we have a post on DoyenSec on SCIM hunting beyond SSO. And what they're talking about here with SCIM is System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, which is something that was kind of intended more for cloud, but is used in other contexts as well. And that's kind of what this post gets into. So it is a bit of a weird setup, and I'll let Z get into the details.
Yeah, you might see some similar vibes of like OAuth, identity provider, service provider sort of deal, where one's going to have like the user pool and user information, and then some other service is going to want to pull that information down. They do call out here that it is not specifically designed to be an identity provider to service provider protocol, but it does provide this sort of generic user pool syncing protocol that can be used. And given kind of how things have evolved, identity provider service provider relationship is the most common place where you're going to see this sort of thing happen. It just it is a full spec that defines some of the operations that you may be able to do on various user objects, on the controlled objects of that. And this is essentially a research post of what type bugs you can kind of be looking for that are going to be somewhat unique to what a SIM is actually doing and trying to accomplish. So yeah, you should still be looking for your usual sort of bugs. Maybe LDAP injection on something like this could exist. Your classic web stuff, but the focus of the post is a lot more on the specific issues that you may encounter with a SIM. So they start off with effectively the fact that auth bypasses. So in this auth system, in a sense, you have auth bypasses. Who would have guessed that there could be something that would break? But it turns out one of the libraries here is being used by Castor, as the actual, I believe it's an open source service, but they utilize a SCIM library that by default did not include authentication on the configuration. So all of these actions that we talked about, these could be called without any sort of authentication. So you could just go ahead and create a new user that maybe matches like the right domain or something that it's going to follow up on looking for. Just go ahead and make that call yourself and do that yourself. Pretty straightforward thing to imagine and to understand. Token management. One solution on kind of the authentication side is to use sort of a shared secret between them to have a value that the identity provider or the service provider will need to provide in order to actually make any of those calls on the identity provider. Or, well, I guess I'm using those terms, but you don't technically have that, but on the SCIM server, to make those calls, to do any of those updates, you would need to know this secret. And they found an interesting bug. They don't call out what the actual identity provider was. They just say a famous identity provider was found. And they had this interesting bug where it seems like when you would change some of the integration, so kind of telling it what to integrate with, where to get the users, whatever, it would make some test requests doing that. And in making those requests, it would include the secret value that's been configured. And they basically just found a leak. So if you had permissions to update the base URL for that, it would keep the same secret, but send it to whatever the new base URL is. So if you change that to an attacker domain, it would leak the secret that way because it wouldn't reset the secret. It wouldn't expect a new secret to be used. I get where the developers are coming from on that. I don't know. It's an interesting way of leaking a secret. It does have a huge privilege ask in that you need to be able to control where you're trying to get the users from in the first place, which is kind of a big ask, and you could probably do something more with that too, but you get that secret value, and now you can make use of that elsewhere and do a lot more kind of on the core system. So I thought that was at least one of the interesting bugs out of this. I'm not going to go through every bug that they have here, but another one was the internal attributes manipulation. And that one just kind of comes down to, you've got these external resources. Again, a lot of things are going to work like OAuth. You've got some service that has some user object, and you've got to convert that into the internal system that the SCIM is actually using for whatever. And that can go wrong. A lot of times, like IDs, for example, are something where there's going to be this assumption that they're generally going to be like some sort of unique identifier. And that doesn't always hold. And perhaps you can make the request in a way that will have a fixed value. So what they found was basically it didn't do any checks. So if you gave an ID that already existed, it would just overwrite the existing ID with whatever this new information was. So they gave it the ID, and they made one of the requests with the ID as superadmin, overwrote the superadmin class with their own user as a member of it, and were able to get kind of a privilege escalation that way. It does have, or kind of has the same feel of the mass assignment sort of thing, which they get in as their second example. We've talked about the verification bypasses before when it comes to OAuth, where like one system may just have like a verified Boolean or something else doesn't know to read it. You can get around the bug they found, or that they talk about, ends up just being that the verification email isn't sent out a second time after changing the email. So if you start the verification process for your own account, you get that email in. Before using that email, or using whatever token you get from that email, you change your email again, and then use the token that you got to the old email to verify as the new email they were able to verify. And that just feels like kind of that isn't even really SIM related in my opinion. That is just like a auth system issue. And I guess a lot of these could be too, but some of them do have to deal specifically with how the SIM works. So yeah, I mean, it's a good read. There's a lot of cool kind of bugs to think about here. Some of the details are a little bit rough, in my opinion, reading through this, but still, I thought there were some cool kind of issues out of this. And they do talk about some other possibilities, like maybe race condition in having multiple operations in a request, or just JSON interop issues, which, parser differentials are always kind of fun to see. So yeah, I enjoyed this post. I thought there were kind of a few interesting bugs being called out here, but it's also just nice to have that, layout of here's kind of the system, how it works, what you should kind of be considering in addition to like your usual bugs.
Yeah. So, getting into our last post, we wanted to shout out the Project Zero post that was posted recently by Dylan Frank, and it's called Breaking the Sound Barrier Part 1 Fuzzing CoreAudio with Mach Messages. So, yeah, it gets into fuzzing with macOS and specifically the IPC mechanism. A lot of it kind of overlaps with stuff that we've talked about a little bit before. So, they talk about this term knowledge driven fuzzing, which is very similar to what we've kind of called, I guess, human in the loop, where it's basically the cycle where you identify like an attack surface, you choose target, create the harness, fuzz and produce crashes, and then in that sort of cycle, you're analyzing crashes and code coverage, you're iterating on your fuzzing harness, trying to improve it, seeing where you can improve your code coverage, and things like that. And just basically keep reiterating that,
Yeah,
and
it's
keeping yourself in the loop instead of just completely automating everything.
yeah, like this. I've never heard the term knowledge driven fuzzing, but it's something we have talked about plenty is that idea of the feedback you get from doing like the reverse engineer on fuzzing and how working on your fuzzer kind of improves the reverse engineering, improves the fuzzer, improves the reverse, and you have that kind of loop going on. That feels like exactly what they're talking about here. They make it a little bit more concrete than what we've talked about in the past, but it's that same idea. And thinking about it, I haven't really seen it documented anywhere, so I'm not like, oh, they're calling it the wrong thing or something here. It's just I haven't really seen it documented, but it is something we've talked about quite a few times. So it's nice to see a little bit of, I guess, agreement with that approach, because I think a lot of fuzzing really has a focus on just get a harness and get running, and like that's where it ends instead of what like a proper campaign looks like, where you are going through this iterative process. Or well, I mean, if you get a lot of bugs right off the bat, maybe you're not iterating too much, but on harder targets.
Yeah. So it also expands a bit on the work that can go into identifying attack surfaces, as well as different options and trade-offs to look at with fuzzing approaches. So, for example, they talk about like in-process fuzzing versus direct harness, and the pluses and minuses there. So, yeah, it's not as like super technically deep as some other Project Zero posts, but it does go into a lot of fuzzing methodology, which we like to call out when it's talked about, because there's still not a ton of great resources for that, at least that I have really seen, that talks about modern smart fuzzing,
No,
coverage guided fuzzing.
I've been trying to look for a resource when it comes like, because people ask about learning fuzzing, and it's like I've got some resources about like, learning to use like AFL or Live Fuzzer and like using the tools,
Mhm.
but not so much about like the process of fuzzing beyond run tool get crashes. And like there
Yeah.
is so much more to it than that, but a lot of things kind of just have a high focus on the tool.
Yeah. Yeah, so this allows you to go deeper on that, and I think there is a lot of useful insights in here. So if you're interested in fuzzing or getting into fuzzing, this is definitely a post to check out. So yeah. So that is the topics we have for this episode. I know it's a little bit of a shorter one, but we did want to get a episode out to give some updates on what was going on and whatnot, and also to put out some content since we hadn't for a while. One other thing that I meant to say this at the beginning, but I kind of forgot. If my audio setup is a little bit weird, I apologize. I am making a little bit of changes with that and hoping to improve it. Um, but yeah, I am in the process of changing it, so that might be why I sound a little bit different. But
Yeah, hoping to
yeah,
improve it, but not yet. No,
yeah,
we wanted to get something out here. It's been a rough time for me to kind of focus on getting an episode out, so this is our attempt to at least put something else out there, and yeah, hopefully we'll keep going.
yeah, yeah. We should be back to normal. Um,
Normal,
soon,
but we're
but
going on break eventually here, so
yeah, it's a bit weird. But yeah, we appreciate you guys all sticking with us all the same, and we also appreciate you for tuning into this episode, and we will see you in the next one.